affinity. You know, that sense of something having meaning for you. You're feeling close to something. I was reading a book by Mark Mazowa on the history of Salonika. Who's the Greek person? Yeah, okay. Or Thessaloniki, as we call it now. And was it that project? Yes, it was. He started, it was incredible. He started with a conversation he'd found in the archives between a diplomat, an Italian diplomat who returned from Germany in the early 40s, speaking to Mussolini and saying, well, the problem, their ideas, the Nazi ideas are really good ideas about Europe and infrastructure and how we should organize and common currency and all that. But he said they are no good at creating affinity with the audience. Well, we know now, of course, that's the opposite of what they were doing. But what he meant was that they weren't allowing people to create a common meaning with them, to create a common project with them. There was no affinity. I'm not sure whether Mussolini was capable of understanding what the diplomat said, but I thought what he said about affinity was really, really interesting. So I started to think about, from Mazowa, from the Italian diplomat, from this conversation in 1942-43, what does it mean in European projects or European governance to create affinity with the subject? Of course, this is actually one of the really big issues still. How does the European Commission create common meaning that you can subscribe to about what Europe is? So it's a big government question, a governing question. And at the same time, I started to read somebody, a French philosopher that I love, called Zaki Laïdi. I think he's probably Moroccan by Laïdi, probably Moroccan. I'm not sure. Algerian. But anyway, between Mazowa and Laïdi, I got this idea about affinity and also meaning. That a governing project that does not encourage affinity and meaning is a failing project, or one that does not involve citizens. It involves heads of corporations and senior diplomats, but not citizens. Markets and globalization in which they appear do not create meanings. They create actions, but not meanings. Okay, now, whether you think Europeanization is good or bad, or you don't even know about it, that is still a serious problem, even on a micro scale or a macro scale. And this must be quotations. Whose community of interest benefits from this lack of hope? And is affinity between transnational governance and citizens going to be a conspicuous absence in the new European education space? So in other words, they put you into it, like now, but they don't create a meaning that you can become close to, make work for you. So making common, socially distributed and networked meanings in Europe means to be engaged in governance of Europe by giving it meaning. And this is a paradox that's inside this project. But it's inside the project of Americanization or anything. That we can work together in networks to try and give meaning to our projects, to the purpose, to PISA. But in doing so, my argument became that at the same time, we were governing ourselves and governing Europe. All right? So that's a double-edged sword. That the more we struggled in our projects and in associations to create meanings, like this is a European, this is what a researcher does, we also become governable. We become a European governed subject. I'll go back to that at the end if I have a question about it. Otherwise, I'm assuming from your faces you all understand what I mean. I found that a particularly difficult thing to both write and to understand, because I'd been working for a long time in the European Association to create common meanings about what we're doing. And then we had this other thought that perhaps what we were doing was making Europe governable in a new way. Imagining a new community, redefining the European. One of the things that happened, and this came from policy documents, is that I realized that a word that I'd always really loved and made a lot of sense to me, education, was disappearing from documents. It's really not there anymore. What you will get is learning. I thought learning was a subsidiary, a secondary question. The main question was education. Well, education is gone, and learning is lifelong learning has replaced it, including even the sense I had at times in documents that you could only now become a European citizen if you were learning. If you weren't learning, you were not a citizen. That's a really new definition of European. And it didn't mean somebody who enjoys going to French museums. It means somebody who is learning, lifelong learning. It had a very powerful governing meaning when they did it. But that lovely word I liked, education, was disappearing. So identity started to mean having the required knowledge and competencies as membership of a common social and cultural area and a mutual understanding of others within it who were acting like you. That the main part of our European identity was now focused on individuated qualities. That is, you built yourself as a European from your learning. And then that you projected that into a space with other people of like minds. And it was no longer a nationally located citizen thinking about others. That was an earlier stage. Though, you know, this is not like fixed. I mean, we still might be in some of these stages. But it was suddenly meant that this didn't come with an army. This didn't come with a very powerful governing. It was European governing, which is quite, I'll mention this more delicate and invisible sometimes. But it was building through the documents, without question, the idea that you will have to have these competencies and knowledge, and you will have to do it by lifelong learning. I'll ask you later if you think you have. And then, so lifelong learning, citizenship, and the new idea from the late mid-90s of the knowledge economy shape and are being shaped together as determining characteristics of this new space. We'll call it the policy space. We call it the European space. We can call it a process of Europeanizing. But these become the key terms that are used in documents all the time. As a little small footnote, I would like to tell you how difficult it was to find policy documents at this time. They all were hiding under different names and sometimes under the names of key people, and I kept searching for what I thought were the key things, the cooperation agreements. And I was finding references in the text of these documents to Cupertino. Cupertino. Do you know anything about Cupertino? C-U-P-E-R-T-I-N-O. Okay? It's where Apple is based, okay? In California. But what was happening, I only found this out after I collected all these documents which mentioned Cupertino, is that if you were using Microsoft Word, which nearly all of us were, if it hadn't been properly checked, the spell checkers sometimes, instead of writing cooperation, would write Cupertino. Okay? So if you think I was some powerful individual understanding how the world worked, I was also a person searching for Cupertino and cooperation agreements when it was just a spell checking error. Okay, now this notion of a homeland. Actually, what was important about his homeland was partly, and I've written about it, partly that in the European Research Association, it was surprising how many people, some of the professors that you have, that I know, who were saying, and I felt this, that in some ways we hadn't got a place in the national. We made a home for ourselves in the European. Okay? So if you can think of your professor, your university, the people that you met, and so forth, then it was surprising how often it would appear in conversation. We kind of created a sort of new homeland. In some cases, I remember people feeling that they were ignored or they placed themselves outside the professoriate or something, or they were just taking a different course. But they actually felt that this was like a kind of academic version of the European Union. They found that they created a home. They gave that place meaning. They constantly worked on shared meanings in the association. And if I was to go back to the early days of ERA, we stopped using cultural stereotypes of ourselves. Well, you're English, you'd do this, or the French, why don't the French? So we stopped using all that as a deliberate effort. We all got to the same place. We didn't have arguments that we would have had in the national. We tried to find a consensus. We tried to explain. We spent more time with each other trying to sort problems. And in some ways, even though ERA is now hugely expanded, that was even what we did inside the structure of the conference. That we decided that we could not have panels or symposia that were just one nationality. So ERA started to construct a sort of common homeland by saying a symposium has to have 3 different countries represented in it. Okay, European countries. We wouldn't allow it any longer. Actually, that was partly me. When I know the Institute of Education in London, the boss of the world, said, we're creating a panel, and it had 8 of their academics on this panel. I said, no, this is imperialism. This is not acceptable. This is not what we're doing in Europe. We are listening to people. We're listening, and we're conversing with people. We are sharing. We are creating a common something. We're creating a meaning against globalization or anything else. But we are creating this. It's not acceptable to behave like that. It's like a bully in the playground. So, but the new home, there was a lot of happening here. The homeland was also that there was new actors emerging. And at the same time that we were mainly publicly employed people, researchers and teachers, there were some new categories, semi-public, private actors. And it was then noticeable that, or at least to me, I was searching out who these new people were in meetings. Not just in the association, but European Union meetings. Who are they? At one meeting of the thematic network, there was teachers in a room, and the organizer would disappear into another room. And I said, what's in the other room? Which is a good research question, always. What's in the next room? But the guy, he said, oh, well, you're talking about teacher education policy, but in the next room, the European Union wants to encourage small software developers and platform developers to grow and develop with your teacher education project, so Europe is not dominated by big American software companies. So there was a more complicated web appearing, and new kinds of actors. They were not only trying to produce something, they were also translating things. They were comparing between places. And this is a most important other one. They were imagining, because that's what this involves. They were imagining a new kind of space that they could work with people. In the case of somebody like Microsoft, their imagination would be fairly simple, really big, but simple. In the case of teacher networks, it would be, how can we work? What do we want to do? So the intellectual homeland was constructed by actors who were of different kinds, who were trying to create meanings about education and learning in Europe. Fine, that's it. If you can't read it, that's bad luck. At the bottom, I started to find words in the literature which talked about cultural hybrids, deterritorialized pioneers. They were creating a new territory to work in. And also, this is a bit odd one, but it's true, professional Europeans. Professional Europeans is quite an interesting one. In some of the projects, our policy projects, actually, the one I enjoyed was, because it seemed to fit a lot of what we knew about policy actors. They were moving between Brussels and the national government, and Brussels and national government. You could say they were translating, but they were also mediating, and they were also editing. And I remember, the example I remember was from Greece, but it was a person who we know later could have been between London and Brussels. They would take a policy from Brussels and then convert it into a local policy. They would take a policy from Greece back into Brussels and then say, they would like us to do this. They would edit it on its journey and edit it on the way back. So like all translation, it's not just translation. It's mediating and it's altering and changing. I remember a German minister at one point saying the trouble with Europe is that the ministers of education, for example, all meet secretly they all meet, they all decide to do something, then they go back to their home countries and says, Brussels wants us to do this. It's a double game, and you can't really get into that. We have very few ethnographers who are working in this, and I would recommend Chris Shaw and Suzanne Wright, who wrote really interestingly anthropologies of this. But generally, we don't get near it. I'm still thinking about homeland and affinities. Professionals and experts are mobilized through attraction, support, and opportunity. Just let's stay there for a minute on that line. In the early 2000s, I think that people in the association, or also the people who were writing projects and working together, felt that the European Union, unlike their national governments, was inviting them to work with them. Well, my national government at the time, I'm trying to think what it was, but it wasn't very good, whatever it was. And so in a way, we were invited to Brussels to speak to policy actors, policy managers. You know, what is it you want? Or we would like the research space to move in this direction, or whatever it was. And then you would try and write an application for funding, sometimes from Brussels, sometimes from social science. And there was a sense in which they were not intruding on your ideas. They seemed just to be encouraging you. Well, at the time, it was different in the UK. Okay, and we even felt often there was a common desire for European education space. there was regional meanings and common European meanings, which seemed to evolve. Words like expertise. Expertise is quite interesting because a lot of government and policy work operates without expertise. It's not necessary. Expertise only gets in the way. We talked about deliberation. They wanted us to think out things with them. We're talking about collective actors, and that is, they recognize associations and networks and societies as actors with them. Okay, I've mentioned regular procedures, I'm not sure, but there was a sense in which governing could include us, and then, as I said earlier, well, if you think of great myths, European myths and legends, sometimes when the giant invites you into his cave, it isn't because the giant is a nice person. Shall I try that again? You know, if you know the German legends of, you know, the Grimm's fairy tales, just because somebody is being nice to you, the witch with Hansel and Gretel, does not mean that's a nice person. So we were increasingly working with Brussels, but also thinking, well, we say in England, what's the catch? What's coming? What are they going to do? What was increasingly obvious, and I don't know if Jenny would talk about this later, but in the big European research projects, we had to go through inclusive processes, but then we were heavily evaluated. We were managed at a distance. The finances could be more and more tightly controlled. Extra levels of evaluation would appear in the process and in the meetings. And it was as if there was there was an invitation, but it was becoming tighter and tighter. Also, what they were doing, if you got a good research project through the European Union, you'd suddenly find that it wasn't just the 5 nations and colleagues that you wanted to work with. 2 more countries would be included. Oh, you didn't know them. These will be the accession countries, countries that the European Union felt should be part of the project. And sometimes they were as bewildered by this as we were by what are you doing? What do you want to do with us? What can we do with you? So there was a sense in which it was attracting, but it was also disciplining and controlling more. We started to see that this loose connections of relations between people of different kinds, experts, producers, was now becoming much more tightly organized. It appears that we were creating a new form of governance. Which Stephen Ball, for example, would not refer to as Europeanizing, but was nevertheless, when he talks about networks, increasingly the way that it was being set up. We were being absorbed into a complex structure, more like a very organic web. And I'm not suggesting to you that there was a mastermind managing all this. I'm just saying that it was a process of European governing that was becoming tighter. But it was a new form. It wasn't just working on national hierarchies, working with key universities. It was allowing us to build strong networks, but then pulling those networks into a governing process. Even though it appeared at times to be informal, okay. That's in an article somewhere. So this was kind of coming as from conversations with consultants in Europe, with watching expert advisors, with working with the association, and thinking, what is going on here? So in other words, it wasn't like, It wasn't like somebody just giving presents. It was gifts. It was somebody, we're thinking, but how does this all come together? How does it work? And even that you became guarded, careful about working in big European projects. Because you were thinking, what does this mean? I will have to produce evaluation regularly. I will have to be examined financially and for effectiveness. I will have to work with colleagues that might not be able to do some of these things. If we don't do it right, we won't be judged high. We won't get another project. So there was, it's complex